And those bullets begin to, when they land, they don't just hit one person, they're going through 2 or 3 bodies at one go.
For a further sort of 10 murderous minutes, these volleys of shots kept coming.
The death toll was basically encompassed children aged 8 all the way up to the elderly aged 80.
They were armed, and they were armed with weapons, they were armed with training, and they were armed with ideas of freedom. The British had been in India since really the 17th century, but had become kingmakers through much of the sort of 18th and into the 19th century. By the mid-1800s, they were in Punjab, which is where this story takes place. If you wind back the clock 100 years to Amritsar of 1919, it's just a very different city. And the most notable difference would be the people. So today it's very much associated with being a Sikh city. Now the Punjab of 1919, where when this massacre takes place, had just come out of the First World War. And while in Britain we were sort of heaving a collective sigh of relief, in India there's almost a sense of expectation, a sense that having given 1.5 million men to the war effort and materials and money, that there would be some kind of quid pro quo. However, the British were actually terrified at almost the end of war, because what they had enjoyed during the 4 years of war was the ability to be able to suppress political expression through emergency legislation. And that was coming to an end just as hundreds of thousands of men, largely Punjabi men, were coming back from war. They were armed, and they were armed with weapons, they were armed with training, and they were armed with ideas of freedom.
And at the end of the war, they also had a huge influenza outbreak, which came back with the Indian troops in 1918. So the Spanish flu actually struck India, and it's believed that the casualties from this was 250 times more than those men who had actually died in the First World War. So, the country was at crippling point.
The political situation in India was such that there had been these kind of nascent independence movements, or at least movements to actually violently throw the British out of India. And at the same time, the emergency legislation that had been in place to control political expression was coming to an end. So the Rowlatt Act was a bit of emergency legislation that was put in place to try to extend the ability of the British to control political expression. Now, of course, it was met with a really very strong reaction from a very early independence or nationalist movement. So names that we're now very familiar with, like Mohandas Gandhi, they really used this idea of the Rowlatt Acts to tell normal people throughout India to express the fact that Britain intended to be quite a heavy-handed master.
So in the days leading up to the massacre, you had the announcements of the Rowlatt Act, and it caused enormous unrest across India. There were riots and protests in places like Delhi and Lahore. In Amritsar, local leaders staged what they call hartal, which means day-long strikes of businesses, shops. And the civil authority, Michael Dwyer in charge, he saw this as a massive threat, and he was very, very cognizant of the fact that if they allowed people like Gandhi to come to the Punjab and to inspire further these local leaders, that they would have a real difficult situation on their hands.
So Michael Dwyer was the Lieutenant Governor of the state of the Punjab. Being the top civil servant, the Governor General of that particular state was a position of very high status. He really made his name, though, through the First World War. Of the 1.5 million men that went to war for the combined British Empire forces, about 40% of them came from Michael O'Dwyer's Punjab. Like most of the British in India, was also very well aware of the vulnerability of the numbers in India. So for every Briton that was in India there were 1,000 to 2,000 Indians, so they absolutely knew the knife's edge upon which there was between good governance and revolution.
So he prevented Gandhi from turning up to Punjab. He exiled the local civil leaders of these strikes, and that really stirred the emotions of the local populace. They're now leaderless, without people who could direct their fury and their anger. The mood of the British at the time was naturally, you expect them to be incredibly tense. There were some who were very aware of the potential for violence and how it could overtake the city. Those in power talked about how they wanted to save the British Raj from an insurrection of the kind that had happened 60 years earlier during what's known as the Indian Mutiny, or if you're in India, it's the Great War of Independence, the First War. They cast the past into the present, and they thought, well, we're going to have this incredible massacre of men, women, and children on our hands. So they were incredibly wary, and that's where Dyer, General Dyer, steps in.
Reginald Dyer was like many military men of his generation that joined the Indian Army. He took it upon himself, and it was very much part of his character. He was a very authoritarian figure, a very sort of iron-fisted type of commander. He was a man who was like most British in India, who knew of the history of and the risk of revolution, and the actions that he took on that day do imply that on the front of his mind was the sense that Amritsar was a city in revolt, and this was possibly the spark of something much bigger. Prior to the 13th, there's one action that takes place which explains what happens. Dyer comes into the city and he posts notices to say there are to be no public meetings. Now, he doesn't know the city, doesn't know how it's constructed, doesn't know the leadership, he doesn't understand how messages are transferred, so it's really an impotent act. But he does it. In his mind, he has stopped any public meeting from happening. The 13th is actually the day of Vaisakhi. It's a very important day in the Sikh calendar and the Hindu calendar. So there would have been lots of pilgrims in the city from adjoining villages. It was also the date for a big cattle fair. So there just would have been a lot of people. And on the same day, those local political leaders that existed had also planned to gather the population in one of the few green spaces in the city called the Jallianwala Bagh. Now, when news of that got back to Dyer, he was absolutely furious. What he saw was insurrection. What he saw were the embers of some kind of revolution.
So Dyer turned up at the Jallianwala Bagh with 2 armoured cars mounted with machine guns. He had 50 riflemen with him from various Indian army regiments, the Gurkhas, the Sindh Rifles, and a Sikh regiment. So he was ready for any sort of warfare that would present itself. He thought in his mind he was coming up against a rebel army. Dyer marches his troops through this narrow alleyway and is confronted with a crowd of 10 to 20,000 people.
Now, the garden is a walled garden with a very narrow entrance, so he couldn't take his armoured cars with his machine guns on them, which mercifully must have saved many hundreds of lives. And he, in his own testimony afterwards, says it took him 30 seconds to bring his men in, to assemble them, to prepare them to fire, and then for the first volley of shots.
And as the speeches are going on, he gives the order to fire. The soldiers were told to continue to fire, or they were left to fire for a full 8 to 10 minutes, and they expended 1,650 rounds, which is on average 33 rounds per soldier.
And that first volley of shots should have told him and all of his men that this was an unarmed crowd. There was no response other than people fleeing for the few exits that existed. But for a further sort of 10 murderous minutes, these volleys of shots kept coming. There were at times pauses while the men looked for direction from Dyer, and Dyer actually directed them towards where people were trying to flee or trying to find what little protection there actually was.
The official estimate was 379 people killed. But more reliably, it's going to be somewhere between 500 to 1,000, and 3 times that number in wounded. And the death toll was basically encompassed children aged 8 all the way up to the elderly aged 80.
The shooting took place in the late afternoon, early evening. The news of it, the noise of it, the knowledge of it slowly spreads throughout this city, and it spreads just before the evening curfew, which now took on this deadly fear that if we break the curfew, maybe they'll fire again. So people were largely left to die. For the family members who knew that their loved ones were missing weren't able to go to the Bagh to look for them. In Indian tradition, you cremate bodies very quickly. So for the next day or 2 days, bodies were slowly recovered. They were dealt with, but equally the entire city was paralyzed really by that trauma. So there wasn't a violent response at all. Quite the opposite. It was very subdued.
The million-dollar question is, why did Dyer shoot? Why didn't he just disperse the crowd? Why didn't he have somebody go in advance and collect that military intelligence so that he could act accordingly? And in many ways, Dyer is a conflicted soul. He gives conflicting evidence. In one of the commissions that was set up at the end of 1919, the Hunter Commission, he says that he didn't do it to save the British Raj or anything of that nature, but he did it because of this whole fear that the British in India would be overrun and there'd be mass murder, and he had to do his horrible dirty duty, as he says. But when he arrives back in England in May 1920, he gives an interview to the Daily Mirror, and he tells them, the reporter, that he did it to save the British Raj. That was his excuse, really. But sitting back 100 years now from that terrible day, you have to ask yourself the question, did he have to do it? And the answer is no, he didn't.
So Michael O'Dwyer was in the Punjab state capital of Lahore, which is about 30 kilometres away from Amritsar, when the actual shooting took place. And Dyer was very anxious after the event to make sure that his version of what had taken place, he must have been aware that what had taken place was exceptional from a policing standpoint. He was very anxious that he gets he was getting the approval of the civil government. So within days, there'd been a number of sort of entreaties up to Lahore, up to the state capital, to ensure that Michael O'Dwyer was receiving the story from the men who were there, and Michael O'Dwyer telegrammed back to Dyer to say, your action was good and the Lieutenant Governor approves. General Dyer then imposed martial law on the city, which basically meant that it was free rein for him to impose yet more constraints on people. And some of those, some of the activities that took place there were beyond humiliation. So there was very famously, probably most well known, is that in the old city itself, within the small winding streets, a missionary lady had been assaulted days before the massacre during the rioting, where she was pulled down from her bike and beaten, but then saved by local residents. The action of Indians beating up a white woman was seen as so shocking that he imposed what was known as the crawling order on that street. So any Indian trying to pass that spot, most of whom were local residents who probably saved her, were forced to crawl on the spot where she was assaulted.
At the time, with Dyer imposing martial law, there was a massive press clampdown, so news of the event didn't get out to the rest of India. In fact, people in the press, editors were being jailed to suppress information coming out of the state of Punjab at the time. But when news did finally reach others, people like Rabindranath Tagore, the Nobel laureate, who had been awarded a knighthood, he wrote to the viceroy renouncing it, saying he was utterly disgusted by the behaviour and how people, his brothers in Punjab, had been treated. So it had an incredibly shocking effect across India, as you can imagine. And many commentators talk about how the Jallianwala Bagh massacre gave new impetus to the independence movement that eventually led to the withdrawal of Britain from India in 1947.
Prior to 1919, really the demand from Indian nationalists was really quite soft. It was dominion status for India, the same status that Canada and places like Canada and New Zealand enjoyed. Now, if you look at the rhetoric after the massacre, it moves to a much sort of harder form of British exit from India and this demand for full independence. Now, in and of itself, it wasn't the tipping point, but I think it was a huge contributory factor. The impact of the massacre was softened by martial law, by the press clampdown. So, and then the commissions that took place almost a year afterwards were really when news started to trickle out. So it didn't have that immediate shocking impact that it does now with the hindsight of 100 years to look back on it.
Back in Britain, there was a massive outpouring of support for Dyer because he was seen as the man who saved the Raj. The incident sparked a debate in the House of Commons and the House of Parliament, the House of Lords, sorry. In the House of Commons, the Secretary of State for War, Winston Churchill, gave a very remarkable summing up of the event, and I'd like to read that. "Let me marshal the facts. The crowd was unarmed except with bludgeons. It was not attacking anybody or anything. It was holding a seditious meeting. When fire had been opened upon it to disperse it, it tried to run away. This was continued for 8 to 10 minutes, and it stopped only when the ammunition had reached the point of exhaustion. If the road had not been so narrow, the machine guns and the armoured cars would have joined in, and after 379 persons, which is about the number gathered together in the chamber today, had been killed, and when most certainly 1,200 or more had been wounded, the troops, at whom not even a stone had been thrown, swung round and marched away. We are to make it absolutely clear, some way or another, that this is not the British way of doing business." And that was Churchill's statement in the House of Commons in 1920. And there was a vote that was passed that condemned Dyer's actions. But the House of Lords actually voted in favour of the action. So there's this incredible battle between both sides of society, the progressives and the conservatives, who were in many ways unable to decide amongst themselves what the nature of Dyer's action was on the Raj. Was it an act of protection that saved men, women and children, or was it an act of terrorism that actually drew the Raj into a very dark place?
So Michael O'Dwyer retired from the Indian Civil Service, actually coincidentally just after the Jallianwala Bagh attack. So while he supported it, or at least supported Dyer in the action, he wasn't caught up in the political outfall. So he came back to the UK with the same level of status that he was. Obviously, he was received very well. In 1940, some 21 years after the events at Jallianwala Bagh, his past really caught up with him, a migrant Indian sort of itinerant worker who had possibly been in Jallianwala Bagh as a small child. Certainly he was a resident of Amritsar. Certainly he would have understood the name and known the name of O'Dwyer and what he represented as this kind of iron-fisted governor and as the man that gave civil confirmation to what Dyer had done. During a public meeting in London, just a stone's throw from the Houses of Parliament, where Sir Michael O'Dwyer was speaking on Afghanistan and India, this man, his name was Udham Singh, who had sort of harboured this dislike of O'Dwyer through much of his life, approached him at the end of that meeting took out a gun from his coat pocket and shot him at point blank range, and Sir Michael Dyer was assassinated.
Dyer was basically dropped from the military in India. It was made very clear to him that the Army Council wasn't interested in having him serve in the army. The various commissions that were set up to inquire into this massacre had come to the same conclusion. And back in England, he wasn't court-martialed or censured in that way. He was let go, basically, and he was left to retire.
Despite the support that he got from the Lieutenant Governor O'Dwyer, Dyer was really left his job in some disgrace as far as he felt it. However, the British population, both in India and in Britain, were hugely supportive of him and what he did. As far as they were concerned, he was defending empire. He was defending them against what could have been a much worse fate. In India today, he's seen as this great villain, and he's seen as somebody that kind of literally got away with murder, because all that's really known about him is that the British population gave him a very generous retirement fund, which he lived out his days with. And I think that's part of the reason why there are these continual and very heightened this year demands for some kind of apology, some kind of atonement by the state for everything that happened.
The British government's never apologised for what happened at Jallianwala Bagh 100 years ago. Many of the families and survivors, they deserve an apology. You'd expect that. But in many ways, the notion of an apology is possibly for everyone else is a bit of a red herring, because it gets the government or people who espouse the views of people like Dyer from the past and the whole notion of empire just being purely good. It gets them off the hook in many ways.
There is a risk that we then sort of draw a line underneath it. We absolve for what took place. And actually what I would much rather happen is that this centenary and this outpouring of interest for Jallianwala Bagh leads to a much more of a sort of a national discussion and understanding of what took place, and a better understanding by people, by cultural institutions, by the media, by government, by politicians on both sides, to understand what really happened in the empire and get a much more rounded view of what took place.
You know, Dyer, when he was in India, he got the support of the vast majority of the British living there, and when he came back to England, he got the vast majority of, the common man. And when you think about it, the attitudes that represents, they were passed down to the next generation. And they were then passed down to the generation when I was growing up in the 70s. And I was confronted with those attitudes. And it's a horrible, nasty thing to grow up with when you're a child and to be told to go back to your own country. And what response does someone like me have to that when my country in the Punjab was taken over and dismantled by the British Raj? Which home have I got to go back to?
We believe the best people to tell the story of what happened on April 13th, 1919 were the people that were there, and that's what we attempt to do in the book. We give them their voice to be able to talk about what happened as a victim, or as a family member of a victim, as a perpetrator, as an eyewitness.